March 1945, Western Germany. For months, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had been preparing for Operation Plunder. It was conceived as the largest river-crossing assault since D-Day, a vast, carefully synchronized offensive across the Rhine, designed to showcase British military precision and finally erase the shadow of the Market Garden failure 6 months earlier. The scale of Operation Plunder was immense. More than 80,000 British and Canadian troops were assigned to the operation. Along the western bank of the Rhine, over 5,000 artillery guns had been emplaced, ready to unleash a devastating preparatory barrage. Prefabricated pontoon bridges waited in staging areas. Time for rapid assembly. Airborne units were scheduled to drop behind German lines, seizing key terrain and blocking enemy reinforcements before they could reach the river. Nothing was left to chance. Montgomery had accounted for every variable. Supply depots were stocked with exact quantities of ammunition, fuel, rations, and medical equipment. Engineers had conducted detailed surveys of the riverbed at multiple crossing points, identifying the most suitable locations for bridge construction. Intelligence officers compiled exhaustive analyses of German defenses, producing precise maps that marked machine gun nests, artillery positions, and troop concentrations. The timetable was fixed down to the minute. At precisely 2,100 hours on March 23rd, the artillery bombardment would begin. Infantry assault boats would launch at 21:30. The first waves would secure bridgeheads on the eastern bank. Engineers would start bridge construction at 2,200 hours. By dawn on March 24th, armored units would be rolling into Germany. This was military planning at its most refined, the kind of deliberate, methodical approach Montgomery believed defined true professionalism. Wars, in his view, should be fought through meticulous preparation, overwhelming force, and controlled risk. So confident was Montgomery that he invited Prime Minister Winston Churchill to witness the operation firsthand. Churchill accepted eagerly. Montgomery promised him a defining moment, a decisive strike that would crack German defenses wide open and clear the road to Berlin. For Montgomery, Operation Plunder was more than a tactical necessity. It was redemption. The disaster at Arnhem in September 1944 had left a stain on his reputation, and he needed a clear, unmistakable victory. Plunder would provide it. It would prove that British forces, when properly led and fully supplied, could match any army in the world. His confidence was total. He had the men. He had the equipment. He had the plan. Every contingency had been addressed. Nothing, he believed, could possibly go wrong. But nearly 200 kilometers to the south, another commander stood before the same river with a very different mindset. Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr., commanding the U.S. Third Army, had received instructions from General Omar Bradley concerning a potential Rhine crossing. Third Army was advancing toward the area around Mainz, roughly 160 kilometers south of Montgomery's planned crossing. Patton was authorized to cross the Rhine at Mainz if circumstances allowed. The orders were clear, but deliberately unhurried. Eisenhower's overall strategy placed priority on Montgomery's northern crossing. Fuel, ammunition, bridging equipment, and logistical support were being concentrated for Operation Plunder. Any Third Army crossing was secondary, intended to follow Montgomery's success once German reserves had been drawn north. Patton understood the logic. He despised it. To Patton, the Rhine was a final great barrier before the heart of Germany. Crossing it swiftly meant ending the war sooner. Crossing it before Montgomery meant proving that American speed and aggression outmatched British caution and elaborate planning. His motivations were many. He wanted glory for American arms, proof that the United States was the dominant Allied power. He wanted recognition for a Third Army, which he had driven relentlessly across France and into Germany. And, undeniably, he wanted personal glory, the kind of bold achievement that would be remembered long after the war ended. But above all else, Patton wanted to beat Montgomery. Their rivalry was deep and intensely personal. They had clashed repeatedly, in Sicily, in France, and throughout the European campaign. Montgomery embodied everything Patton loathed, excessive caution, rigid planning, and an obsession with set-piece battles instead of rapid exploitation. Worse still was Montgomery's attitude toward American forces. He often implied that British troops were more professional and disciplined, that American victories would result of sheer material superiority rather than skill, and that commanders like Patton were reckless cowboys, brave, perhaps, but lacking true military sophistication. Patton was determined to prove him wrong, publicly and decisively, by crossing the Rhine first, with minimal preparation, and at a fraction the cost of Montgomery's carefully choreographed operation. As Third Army pushed toward the Rhine in mid-March, Patton quietly prepared for an opportunistic crossing. Assault boats were moved closer to the river. Potential crossing sites were identified. He was waiting for his moment. Patton coordinated quietly with his engineers, discussing bridge construction and river conditions. Then he waited. He was looking for a single thing, the moment when circumstances would tilt in his favor. That moment came on March 22nd. Third Army reconnaissance reported that German defenses near the town of Oppenheim, south of Mainz, were dangerously thin. The sector was lightly held. German forces had shifted north, convinced that the main Allied crossing would take place in Montgomery's area. Oppenheim had been left exposed. Patton made his decision instantly. Third Army would cross at Oppenheim. Not in days. Not in weeks. That night, March 22nd, 1945. What Patton planned could not have been more different from Montgomery's carefully staged operation. There would be no thunderous artillery barrage to warn the enemy. No airborne landings. No complex coordination between air and ground forces. Just infantry, canvas assault boats, darkness, and speed. The crossing would rely entirely on surprise rather than overwhelming firepower. Patton's staff objected immediately. A crossing launched with such haste violated established doctrine. Reconnaissance was incomplete. Artillery support was poorly positioned. Medical facilities were not yet in place. If the Germans responded in force, casualties could be catastrophic. Patton dismissed every objection. German units, he insisted, were disorganized and unprepared. If Third Army moved fast enough, they could establish a bridgehead before German commanders even realized the crossing was underway. Preparation could wait. Speed could not. Surprise, in Patton's view, was more decisive than firepower. At 2,230 hours on March 22nd, elements of the 5th Infantry Division began crossing the Rhine at Oppenheim. Canvas assault boats, each carrying roughly 12 soldiers, slipped silently onto the dark water. The eastern bank remained eerily quiet. There were no searchlights, no machine gun fire, no artillery. The Germans were completely unprepared. Many were asleep. Others were positioned far to the rear, convinced the front line was stable. When American infantry emerged from the darkness and overran German positions, resistance collapsed almost instantly. By dawn on March 23rd, Third Army held a firm bridgehead on the eastern bank of the Rhine. Engineers were already assembling pontoon bridges. Armor was preparing to cross. Casualties were astonishingly low. Fewer than 34 men killed or wounded during the entire operation. Patton had done it. He had crossed the Rhine ahead of schedule, with minimal preparation, and at negligible cost. It was a very kind of audacious gamble that had defined his career. Now, there was only one thing left to do. Make sure everyone knew about it, preferably before Montgomery's grand operation even began. March 23, 1945. Morning. 3rd Army Headquarters. Patton was awake before dawn, studying reports from Oppenheim. The news was even better than he had hoped. The bridgehead was expanding. German counterattacks were weak and disorganized. Engineers were making rapid progress on bridge construction. Within hours, armored units would be moving into Germany. The crossing had exceeded even Patton's most optimistic expectations. A river that German propaganda had declared impassable, one that doctrine insisted could only be crossed through massive preparation and overwhelming force, had been breached by a single division using canvas boats and surprise. Patton's instinct was to announce the achievement immediately, to inform Bradley, to notify Eisenhower, to make certain the success was recognized. But Patton understood something else as well. Timing was everything. If higher headquarters learned too soon, they might order him to halt, to consolidate, to wait for coordination. Instead, Patton chose to create facts on the ground, to push enough troops across the Rhine that any order to withdraw would be impractical. By mid-morning, 2 regiments of the 5th Infantry Division were across the river. The bridgehead was roughly 5 kilometers deep and expanding. German units were retreating or surrendering in large numbers. Third Army was no longer merely across the Rhine. They were advancing into Germany. Patton decided the moment had arrived. He placed a call to 12th Army Group headquarters. When General Omar Bradley came on the line, Patton's voice was deliberately casual, as though he were reporting routine movements rather than a historic breakthrough. He informed Bradley that 3rd Army had crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim. The bridgehead was secure. 2 divisions would be across by nightfall. Casualties were minimal. Bradley was stunned. He had not authorized a crossing at Oppenheim. 3rd Army had been expected to cross at Mainz. Later, and with coordination, Patton calmly explained that the opportunity had presented itself. German defenses were weak. Waiting for formal approval would have allowed the enemy to react. So he had acted. Bradley found himself torn between frustration at Patton's insubordination and admiration for the results. In a single night, 3rd Army had accomplished what conventional planning claimed would take weeks. Germany's last major defensive barrier had been breached at a cost lower than an average day of routine combat. Bradley made the only practical decision. The crossing was already a reality. Ordering a withdrawal would waste a priceless opportunity. Instead, the success would be supported and exploited. But Patton was not content with simply informing Bradley. By the evening of March 23rd, German forces had begun responding to the crossing at Oppenheim. Artillery fire fell on the growing bridgehead. Luftwaffe aircraft made sporadic attacks against the pontoon bridges. The crossing was no longer a secret. That night, Patton called Bradley again. This time, his tone was no longer casual. It was urgent, insistent. Patton demanded that the news be released to the press immediately. He wanted the world to know, without delay, that 3rd Army had crossed the Rhine before Montgomery's Operation Plunder had even begun. Patton's motive was obvious. Montgomery had spent months preparing his crossing. Operation Plunder was scheduled to begin within hours. Churchill was already in position to observe it. British and American newspapers stood ready to portray the operation as a decisive breakthrough for the European war. Patton intended to steal that moment completely. He wanted headlines announcing that an American army had already crossed the Rhine, quietly, quickly, and successfully, before the British assault even fired its first artillery round. He wanted Montgomery's meticulously choreographed operation to unfold in the shadow of 3rd Army's improvised triumph. Bradley understood exactly what Patton was doing. It was competitive, political, undeniably petty. It would enrage Montgomery and strain already fragile relationships within the Allied command. Eisenhower would not be pleased to see Patton grandstanding instead of maintaining professional restraint. But Bradley also recognized something else. Patton was right. The crossing at Oppenheim had proven that the Rhine could be breached rapidly and at minimal cost. That overwhelming preparation was not always necessary. That American forces, through speed and audacity, could achieve results that others required months to plan. Bradley authorized the release. The timing was calculated with care. Late enough that Montgomery could not accelerate Operation Plunder, but early enough that American newspapers would carry the story before British papers could dominate the narrative. The news reached Montgomery at 11:20 a.m. on March 23rd, just 13 hours before Operation Plunder was scheduled to begin. Montgomery was at his forward headquarters, conducting final operational reviews, when an aide delivered the report. 3rd Army had crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim. His reaction, witnessed by several officers, was outwardly calm and unmistakably dismissive. He acknowledged that Patton had crossed a river. Then he characterized the action as typically American, impulsive, hurried, and lacking proper planning. Operation Plunder, he said, would proceed as scheduled and would demonstrate the difference between merely crossing a river and conducting a proper military operation. The comment revealed Montgomery's worldview. In his mind, Patton's action was not a true operation at all, more a raid or a reconnaissance in force. It lacked scale. It lacked preparation. It lacked the comprehensive planning that, to Montgomery, defined serious warfare. Operation Plunder, by contrast, would be a model of modern combined arms doctrine, massive artillery support, airborne landings, coordinated engineering efforts, overwhelming force applied at decisive points. This, Montgomery believed, was the crossing historians would study and future officers would be taught to emulate. But beneath the professional disdain was genuine fury, months of preparation, thousands of tons of supplies, a promise made to Churchill that this would be the crowning moment of the war, now eclipsed by an American general using canvas boats in raw audacity. Montgomery's anger was not merely personal. It was philosophical. Montgomery believed wars were won through careful planning and methodical execution. Patton believed wars were won through speed, aggression, and ruthless exploitation of opportunity. The Rhine crossing would be cited for decades as evidence for one approach or the other, and Patton had just scored the opening point, crossing first, faster, and at a fraction of the cost. Over the next 48 hours, the contrast became impossible to ignore. Operation Plunder unfolded exactly as planned. Artillery fire began on schedule. Infantry crossed in assault boats. Engineers constructed bridges under fire. Airborne troops dropped behind German lines. The operation was precise, professional, and expensive. Thousands of tons of ammunition were expended during the bombardment. Airborne units suffered significant casualties when some landings encountered stronger resistance than expected. The crossing itself, though successful, resulted in more than 500 casualties. Meanwhile, Third Army's bridgehead at Oppenheim expanded relentlessly. By March 25th, just 3 days after the initial crossing, 2 full divisions were across the Rhine. Third Army was advancing eastward with minimal opposition. Total casualties remained under 100. The statistics told a stark story. Montgomery's crossing involved 80,000 troops, 5,000 artillery pieces, massive air support, and months of preparation, at a cost exceeding 500 casualties. Patton's crossing began with a single division, minimal artillery, no air support, and virtually no preparation, at a cost of fewer than 100 casualties. 2 generals, 2 philosophies, 1 river, and a rivalry that would echo through military history. Newspaper coverage quickly reflected the contrast between the 2 crossings. American newspapers ran triumphant headlines celebrating Third Army's audacious success. The story of Patton's crossing dominated front pages, framed as a stunning feat of speed and initiative. British newspapers gave extensive coverage to Operation Plunder, but they could not escape the central fact. The Americans had crossed the Rhine first. The narrative Montgomery had hoped to control, that British forces had delivered the decisive blow across the Rhine, was irretrievably lost. Winston Churchill, who had traveled to Germany specifically to witness Montgomery's operation, found himself discussing Patton's crossing almost as much as Plunder itself. Publicly, the Prime Minister was diplomatic, praising both actions as vital contributions to victory. Privately, however, he was reportedly amused by Patton's audacity and by Montgomery's visible discomfort. For Montgomery, the situation was intolerable. From his perspective, Patton had deliberately undermined Operation Plunder's significance. He had acted without authorization to seize glory that properly belonged to 21st Army Group. Worse still, he had violated the fundamental principle of coordinated operations upon which Allied cooperation depended. Montgomery believed there had to be consequences. If generals were allowed to ignore operational plans and launch unauthorized offensives whenever opportunity appeared, military discipline would erode. Coalition warfare would become chaos. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, in Montgomery's view, needed to act decisively. By March 26, Montgomery had reached a conclusion. He would formally recommend that Patton be relieved of command. Not, he would argue, as punishment, though he personally believed Patton deserved it, but as a necessary measure to enforce discipline and preserve operational coordination. His reasoning was direct and uncompromising. Patton had launched a major river crossing operation without authorization. He had violated the agreed plan that assigned priority for Rhine crossings to 21st Army Group. He had done so not out of military necessity, Montgomery believed, but for personal glory. And in the process, he had turned a critical strategic operation into a competition rather than a coordinated Allied effort. Therefore, Montgomery would recommend that Patton be removed from command of Third Army and reassigned to a role where his aggressive instincts could be controlled and employed without disrupting theater-wide operations. It was an extraordinary recommendation. Montgomery was Eisenhower's deputy for ground operations. His opinion carried significant weight, and he was prepared to press the issue forcefully. The confrontation that followed would test the limits of Allied unity and force Eisenhower into a stark choice: support his difficult but brilliant American general, or preserve harmony with his British deputy by sacrificing Patton. March 26, 1945. 21st Army Group Headquarters, Germany. Montgomery drafted his message to Eisenhower with the same precision he applied to military planning. The communication was formal, professional, and unambiguous. It framed the issue strictly in terms of discipline and command responsibility, not personal rivalry. The central argument was simple. Patton had conducted a major Rhine crossing without authorization from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Third Army's orders were to advance to the Mainz area and prepare for a crossing there when approved. Instead, Patton crossed at Oppenheim, a different location entirely, and did so days ahead of any sanctioned timeline. This, Montgomery argued, was not a minor deviation. It was a fundamental breach of command authority. If Army commanders were permitted to initiate major operations based on perceived opportunity, rather than coordinated plans, the Allied command structure would cease to function. Montgomery emphasized that the issue was not success or failure. He explicitly acknowledged that the crossing at Oppenheim had succeeded. But success, he insisted, did not retroactively justify insubordination. Military discipline required accountability regardless of outcome. He also addressed the broader consequences for Allied cooperation. Resources, bridging equipment, artillery, ammunition, and air support had been allocated on the understanding that Operation Plunder would be the primary Rhine crossing in late March. Patton's unauthorized action disrupted those allocations and complicated coordination between British and American forces at a critical moment. Finally, Montgomery argued that Patton's behavior followed a familiar pattern. In Sicily, in France, and now in Germany, Patton had repeatedly stretched or ignored orders, prioritized personal initiative, and placed individual achievement above coalition coordination. Montgomery's conclusion was unequivocal. General George S. Patton, Jr. should be relieved of command of Third Army, not as a personal rebuke, but because his command style was incompatible with the demands of coalition warfare. His talents, Montgomery suggested, could be better employed in roles where aggression was an asset rather than a liability, perhaps in occupation duties or operational planning. But he should not command a field army where Allied coordination was essential. The message was transmitted through secure channels to Supreme Headquarters on March 26, marked for Eisenhower's personal attention. Montgomery was confident. He had framed the issue as a matter of discipline, authority, and coalition integrity. He had acknowledged Patton's success, while asserting that success could not excuse defiance. Now, the decision rested with Eisenhower. Montgomery had framed his recommendation carefully. He positioned it as essential for maintaining Allied cooperation, an argument he knew would resonate with Eisenhower, a commander who had spent years managing the delicate politics of coalition warfare. But Montgomery also understood the risk he was taking. Eisenhower might not support relieving Patton. American public opinion adored him. Patton was celebrated as a bold, victorious general, a man who got results. Removing him would be politically explosive. Yet Montgomery believed principle outweighed politics. To maintain effective command and control over the Allied armies, discipline had to be enforced. Generals who acted independently, rather than in coordination with their allies, could not be allowed to undermine the chain of command. While Montgomery's message was in transit to Supreme Headquarters, the situation on the ground continued to evolve. Third Army's bridgehead at Oppenheim was now 15 kilometers deep. 2 full divisions were across the Rhine and pressing eastward. Patton was already planning the next phase, a rapid advance toward Frankfurt, then deeper into Germany. Operation Plunder was also proceeding successfully. By March 26, British and Canadian forces had established solid bridgeheads and were expanding eastward. The operation was meeting all its objectives, but at higher cost than Patton's crossing, and the narrative had already been set. Newspapers emphasized Patton's dramatic, headline-grabbing achievement as the breakthrough moment. Operation Plunder was reported as important, yes, but secondary, a follow-on operation rather than the decisive blow Montgomery had intended. This infuriated Montgomery. It was not only wounded pride, he believed it was strategically misleading. Patton's crossing at Oppenheim had been tactically brilliant, but strategically, Montgomery argued, the decisive action was occurring in the north, where 21st Army Group faced concentrated German reserves and would strike directly at the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. But newspapers rarely reported nuanced strategy. They reported drama. And Patton crossing the Rhine in canvas boats made a far better story than Montgomery's methodical, professional operation. Montgomery's frustration was compounded by stories of Patton's personal theatrics after crossing. 2 days after establishing the bridgehead, Patton had walked onto one of the pontoon bridges constructed by his engineers. Witnesses reported that halfway across, he stopped, stepped at the edge, and urinated into the Rhine. When asked why, Patton had reportedly said he'd been waiting a long time to do precisely that, to literally piss on Germany's last offensive barrier. It was vintage Patton, crude, theatrical, designed for maximum symbolic impact. Montgomery found the gesture vulgar, unprofessional, and emblematic of everything he despised: showmanship, irreverence, and prioritization of personal gestures over military professionalism. American soldiers, of course, loved it. The story spread rapidly throughout Third Army and then across American forces in Europe. Patton literally pissing on Hitler's Germany became legend, a symbol of audacity and contempt for enemy defenses. The contrast between Montgomery and Patton could not have been sharper. Montgomery waged war like a chess player, careful, deliberate, focused on position, resources, and calculated risk. Patton waged war like a cavalry commander, fast, aggressive, dramatic, prioritizing momentum and morale. Neither approach was inherently superior. Both had strengths and weaknesses, but they were fundamentally incompatible philosophies, and the Rhine crossing had become a referendum on which method produced results. From Montgomery's perspective, the answer should have been obvious. Operation Plunder had involved proper planning, preparation, and coordinated execution. It had achieved its objectives with acceptable casualties. It was textbook modern warfare. But from the public and, increasingly, the military perspective, Patton's approach had won. He had crossed faster, cheaper, and more dramatically, demonstrating that speed and audacity could achieve results that months of careful planning could not match. Montgomery's message reached Eisenhower's headquarters on the evening of March 26, marked urgent and for the Supreme Commander's eyes only. Staff officers understood the sensitivity and ensured it was delivered personally to Eisenhower. Eisenhower read Montgomery's arguments carefully. Patton had acted without authorization. He had violated the agreed operational plan. He had a history of independent action that sometimes bordered on insubordination. Montgomery argued that discipline and coordination had to take precedence. Eisenhower faced the dilemma Montgomery had anticipated. support his British deputy and enforce military discipline, or protect his brilliant but unruly American general, whose audacity had delivered results beyond expectation. The decision would define Eisenhower's approach to managing his most difficult and most effective subordinate. It would also send a clear signal about what mattered more in the final months of the war: strict cooperation and coordination, or speed and results. Eisenhower did not respond immediately. Eisenhower knew he had to consider his response carefully. Every angle mattered: the military implications, the political ramifications, and the personal relationships involved. But he also understood one simple truth: no matter what he decided, someone would be furious. If he relieved Patton, American forces would see it as capitulation to British pressure, favoritism toward Montgomery. If he refused, Montgomery would view it as tolerance of insubordination and favoritism toward Americans. There was no path that would satisfy everyone. Eisenhower would have to choose which principle mattered most and accept the consequences. Privately, he had already begun forming his conclusion. He understood something about Patton that Montgomery perhaps did not fully appreciate. Patton was more than a talented tactical commander. He was a force multiplier, a general whose presence and personality drove soldiers to achieve feats they had thought impossible. The Rhine crossing at Oppenheim was the perfect example. No other American general would have attempted such a daring operation with so little preparation. No other general would have succeeded with so few casualties. Patton had done it because he believed it could be done, and because his soldiers believed in him. Could Eisenhower afford to lose that now, in the final months of the war, when bold, rapid advances might bring the conflict to a decisive end? The answer was beginning to crystallize, and it was an answer Montgomery would not like. March 27, 1945. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, Reims, France. Eisenhower sat at his desk with Montgomery's message in front of him. He had read it multiple times, weighing every argument. The recommendation was serious and formally presented, demanding a substantive response. As Supreme Commander, Eisenhower constantly balanced competing demands: military effectiveness, political sensitivity, Allied cooperation, national interests, and personal relationships. Every decision involved trade-offs, and every trade-off guaranteed dissatisfaction somewhere. The Patton question epitomized those competing pressures. Montgomery's arguments were valid. Patton had operated outside authorized parameters, launching a major operation without coordination. He had disrupted resource allocations and complicated planned operations. These were real concerns. Military organizations function through discipline and coordination. Commanders who act independently threaten chaos. If Patton's actions went unpunished, other commanders might conclude that ignoring orders was acceptable whenever convenient. But Eisenhower also had to consider results. Patton's Rhine crossing had accomplished in one night what conventional planning suggested would take weeks. Third Army had breached Germany's last major defensive line with minimal casualties and was advancing rapidly into the heart of the country. The strategic impact was substantial and overwhelmingly positive. Moreover, Eisenhower understood something difficult to codify in formal terms. Patton possessed an almost uncanny ability to read the battlefield, seize fleeting opportunities, and exploit weaknesses that cautious commanders might miss. His timing was precise. His risks were calculated. His audacity produced results that methodical approaches could not match. Yes, this brilliance came at a cost. Patton was notoriously hard to manage. He resisted restrictions. He prioritized independence over coordination. He measured success in terms of ground gain and enemy losses, not adherence to plans. Working with him demanded constant vigilance and intervention. But Eisenhower had been managing Patton for years: North Africa, Sicily, France, and now Germany. He had learned to channel that aggressive energy productively while minimizing disaster. It was exhausting, frustrating, and profoundly effective. Now he had to weigh: did the benefits of keeping Patton in command outweigh the costs of his insubordination? Did tactical brilliance justify violations of procedure? Could results excuse unorthodox methods? There was also the political dimension. Patton was immensely popular with American soldiers and the public alike. Bold, confident, victorious, he was the embodiment of American military spirit. Removing him would trigger a storm of criticism in the United States. Newspapers would portray it as British envy, as Montgomery using authority to curb American audacity, as procedure triumphing over victory. The political fallout would be severe, potentially straining Eisenhower's relations with the U.S. War Department and Congress. Conversely, ignoring Montgomery's recommendation risked alienating Britain's most senior field commander. Montgomery would see it as favoritism toward American commanders, tolerance of indiscipline, and a challenge to his authority as Eisenhower's deputy for ground operations. There was no consequence-free choice. Eisenhower had to decide which risks he was willing to accept. He drafted his response carefully. The message acknowledged Montgomery's concerns about discipline and coordination. It recognized that Patton's Rhine crossing had not followed approved procedures. It conceded that better communication and coordination would have been preferable, but it also made one thing unmistakably clear. Eisenhower would not relieve Patton of command. The reasons were both military and practical. Militarily, Third Army's performance throughout the campaign had been exceptional. Patton's aggressive leadership had produced results that justified continued confidence in his command. Practically, the war was entering its final phase. German forces were collapsing. Now was the time for momentum, not restraint. The priority now was rapid exploitation. German forces were retreating, but they could still regroup and establish new defensive lines. This was exactly the type of situation where Patton's strengths mattered most. Eisenhower's message was clear. He would address coordination issues with Patton directly. Future operations required better communication with SHAF headquarters. But removing Patton from command was not warranted, given his performance and the current strategic situation. The response was diplomatic but firm. Eisenhower was supporting Patton, despite the procedural violations Montgomery had identified. The message was transmitted to 21st Army Group headquarters on March 28th. Montgomery's reaction was predictably negative. He saw Eisenhower's decision as prioritizing American interests over military discipline, as failing to enforce the standards of coordination and cooperation that coalition warfare demanded. Yet Montgomery also recognized he had lost the argument. Eisenhower had made his decision. Further protests would only create friction without changing the outcome. Montgomery accepted the ruling professionally, though his frustration with Patton and his doubts about Eisenhower's judgment intensified. The tension between Montgomery and Patton would last the remainder of the war. They would never become cordial. They would never genuinely respect each other's methods. But under Eisenhower's leadership, they would function professionally within the command structure. Meanwhile, Patton learned of Montgomery's recommendation and Eisenhower's decision. His reaction was a mixture of satisfaction and resentment. Satisfaction that Eisenhower had supported him, resentment that Montgomery had attempted to have him removed. Patton's comments, relayed by multiple sources, captured his perspective on Allied command politics. When he discovered that Eisenhower had allocated more supplies to Montgomery's operation than the Third Army, Patton reportedly muttered that Eisenhower was the best general the British had. It was a cruel joke, reflecting Patton's frustration with constraints coalition warfare imposed on his operations. Eisenhower had to balance American and British interests. Patton only cared about Third Army's objectives. Eisenhower understood this, and he knew Patton's remark was more about venting than serious criticism. The two men had known each other for decades. They understood each other's strengths and limitations, and their relationship, though tense, was built on mutual respect. As both operations succeeded, the Rhine crossing controversy gradually faded. Third Army continued its rapid advance eastward. British and Canadian forces pushed north of the Ruhr. Allied armies were now deep inside Germany, and final victory was approaching. Yet the Rhine crossing left a lasting legacy in military history and popular memory. It became the definitive example of the contrast between Montgomery's methodical approach and Patton's audacious style. Military historians would debate for decades which approach had been more effective. The statistical contrast was stark. Montgomery's Operation Plunder involved 80,000 troops, 5,000 artillery pieces, extensive air support, and months of preparation. It achieved all objectives but cost over 500 casualties. Patton's crossing at Oppenheim initially involved a single division, minimal fire support, virtually no preparation, and cost fewer than 100 casualties. By the numbers alone, Patton's approach appeared more efficient. But efficiency was not the only measure of military effectiveness. Montgomery's crossing had strategic goals beyond simply reaching the eastern bank. It was designed to draw German reserves north and enable a massive breakthrough into Germany's industrial heartland. Patton's crossing, by contrast, was opportunistic exploitation of weak enemy defenses. Both operations were valid, and both achieved significant objectives. Yet public perception was clear. Patton had won the race to cross the Rhine, and he had done so spectacularly. His act of urinating into the Rhine became legendary. Crude, theatrical, but emblematic of his personality and approach to war. Patton showed contempt for obstacles that others considered formidable. He reduced Germany's last major defensive barrier to something he could literally piss on. American soldiers loved it. It expressed exactly what they felt. German defenses were no longer intimidating. Victory was inevitable, and the enemy that seemed so powerful in 1944 was now beaten and demoralized. Montgomery, of course, found the gesture vulgar and unprofessional. But he and Patton had fundamentally different concepts of military professionalism. Montgomery valued planning, coordination, and adherence to established procedures. Patton valued results, speed, and morale-building gestures. Neither was wrong. They were simply different commanders, operating in different contexts. Montgomery excelled at set-piece battles where preparation and resources could be concentrated. Patton excelled at exploitation and pursuit, where speed and aggression were paramount. Eisenhower's genius lay in recognizing these differences and using both commanders effectively. He gave Montgomery responsibility for operations requiring careful planning and coordination, while relying on Patton for rapid, audacious action that could exploit weaknesses and maintain momentum. Eisenhower gave Patton responsibility for operations that demanded speed and audacity, while managing the inevitable conflicts between him and Montgomery to prevent personal rivalry from undermining the overall campaign. The Rhine crossing episode demonstrated Eisenhower's approach perfectly. He did not punish Patton for insubordination, because Patton's defiance had produced results of immense value. Yet he communicated clearly that better coordination would be expected in future operations. He balanced discipline with pragmatism. This was not textbook leadership. Military doctrine dictated that commanders who violated orders should face consequences. But Eisenhower understood that doctrine was a guide, not an absolute rule. Exceptional commanders sometimes required exceptional management. By early April 1945, Third Army was racing across central Germany. British and Canadian forces were encircling the Ruhr. American forces were approaching the Elbe River. German resistance was collapsing. The war was entering its final weeks. When historians later analyzed how the war was won, the Rhine crossings featured prominently. Montgomery's careful, methodical preparation at Wesel, Patton's audacious dash at Oppenheim. Both had broken German defenses and enabled the final Allied offensives. But in popular memory, it was Patton's crossing that endured. The story of the general who crossed the Rhine in canvas boats with sheer audacity, who beat his rival to the punch, who urinated in the river as a gesture of contempt, who proved that sometimes speed and boldness mattered more than preparation and caution. Montgomery completed his elaborate crossing exactly as planned. It was executed with precision, achieved all objectives, but the headlines were already old news. Patton had crossed first, and somewhere in Germany, advancing toward Frankfurt and beyond, Patton was almost certainly smiling. He had done exactly what he always wanted. proved that speed and daring still won wars, that American audacity could outmatch British caution, that he, George Patton, was the finest tactical commander of his generation. Eisenhower allowed him that satisfaction because he understood something fundamental about Patton. He needed to win. He needed to compete. He needed to prove himself constantly. Managing Patton was exhausting, a source of endless headaches. But it also produced results that more cautious, controllable commanders could not achieve. So Eisenhower kept Patton in command. He managed his ego, channeled his aggression, tolerated his insubordination when it produced victories, and absorbed the political fallout of having a subordinate who was brilliant, difficult, and indispensable to winning the war. The Rhine crossing controversy ended not with a clear resolution, but with practical acceptance. Montgomery believed Patton should have been relieved. Patton believed Montgomery was jealous and obsolete. Eisenhower believed both had value, and managed them accordingly. The war continued, racing toward its conclusion, with two very different generals proving that there was more than one way to win battles, even if they could never agree on which way was best.